The hidden truth about what the Palantíri really were, LOTR lore. What if the most dangerous weapon in the War of the Ring never cast a single spell, never struck a single blow, and never told a single lie? That is not a riddle. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a precise description of what the Palantíri actually were, and what they actually did, and why the casual understanding of them as Sauron's surveillance technology misses the horror entirely. Here is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down. Not the films. Not the wiki summaries. Tolkien's own words, in unfinished tales, in the letters, in the Silmarillion, in the appendices. And once you see what those words add up to, once you understand what these stones were and where they came from and how they actually worked, the story of the Third Age changes shape around you. The corruption of Saruman looks different. The fall of Denethor looks different. And the question that sits at the center of all of it, the question this entire script is going to orbit, becomes something genuinely unanswerable in a way that reaches far outside Middle-earth. If the Palantíri could never lie, and Sauron only ever showed what was real, was Denethor's despair a corruption? Or was it the most accurate strategic assessment made by any leader in the War of the Ring? Hold that. Do not answer it yet. Because before you can feel the full weight of that question, you need to understand what the stones actually were. And that story starts much earlier than most people think. It starts in the First Age. It starts with the most dangerous mind that ever walked on Arda. The thing about Fëanor is that everyone knows his name, and almost nobody understands what made him singular. He was not simply the greatest craftsman of the Noldor. He was not simply the elf who made the Silmarils. He was something stranger and more troubling than that. Tolkien, in the Silmarillion, describes Fëanor as the mightiest in all parts of body and mind, in valor, in endurance, in beauty, in understanding, in skill, and in subtlety of craft. That last phrase is the one that matters. Subtlety of craft. Not power of craft. Not even genius of craft. Subtlety. Because what Fëanor believed, what drove every great work of his life, was a specific and consuming philosophical conviction that the highest act of a creative mind was to capture living reality in permanent, transmissible form. To take something true and present and real, something that existed only in the moment of its existence, and fix it, hold it, make it available to perception across time and distance. That was the ambition. That was the hunger. The Silmarils were the supreme expression of that hunger. Fëanor captured the light of the two trees, the living light of Valinor itself, the most sacred and irreplaceable luminance in the world, and he locked it into 3 jewels. Not a copy of the light itself, captured, contained, made portable, made permanent. The Silmarillion tells us that the light lived in the Silmarils as it lived in no other vessel, that the jewels hallowed themselves against the touch of evil, that even the Valar marveled at them. And here is the thing that the fandom almost universally overlooks. Letter 131. Tolkien, writing to Milton Waldman in one of his most expansive explanations of the legendarium's internal history, connects the Palantíri directly to Fëanor, not to Númenor, not to the Noldorin craftsmen who came later, to Fëanor himself, in the First Age, whose arts were behind so many of the works of the Númenorians. Think about what that means. The Palantíri are not a product of Númenorian ingenuity. They are an inheritance. They are Fëanorian objects, carrying within their design the same creative philosophy that produced the Silmarils, filtered through the arts of the greatest civilization of the Second Age. The same hunger to capture the living present. The same obsessive drive to see and hold what exists in the moment of its existence. Only where the Silmarils captured light, the Palantíri captured perception itself. They did not show images of the world. They showed the world, directly, without mediation. And that is precisely where the horror begins. Unfinished Tales contains an essay titled The Palantíri, and it is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in all of Tolkien's extended legendarium. Not because it is dramatic, because it is precise. Tolkien catalogues the properties of the seven stones with methodical care, and somewhere in that catalogue, almost buried in the technical detail, he states the thing that changes everything. The Palantíri show only things that are real and exist, not things that might be, not things that a sufficiently powerful will could project into them. Real things, present things, past things that actually occurred. The stones are ontologically incapable of fabrication. They are, in a very specific and terrible sense, instruments of pure truth. Picture this. You are a Maya of immense intelligence, a being of vast psychological cunning, who has spent thousands of years studying the architecture of mortal minds, who has watched civilization after civilization rise and fall, and who understands, better than anyone else alive, the specific ways that intelligence can become a trap for the intelligent. You have no physical form worth mentioning. You cannot march your armies to every corner of Middle-earth at once. But you have a stone, one stone, the Ithil stone, taken from Minas Ithil when it fell in Third Age 2002. And you know with complete certainty that any one of the remaining stones that is used without perfect mastery of will creates a point of contact, an open window through which you can control what the watcher sees. You cannot invent, you cannot fabricate, but you can select. You can choose which true things to illuminate, which real corridors of the world to open, which accurate images to present, in which order, to which mind, at which moment of that mind's maximum vulnerability. You are not a deceiver, you are a curator of reality. And that, Tolkien writes in Letter 183, is the essential nature of Sauron's power in the Third Age. He was not primarily a military force. He was, in Tolkien's own words, a dominator of minds, a being whose deepest weapon was not darkness, but a specific, surgical, calibrated illumination of the truth. Now hold that image. Because we need to go further back before we go forward. We need to understand what Sauron was working with, structurally, before he ever touched the Ithil stone. And that means understanding something that happened in Gondor, centuries before the fall of Minas Ithil, that quietly destroyed the Palantíri network in a way no one has ever recovered from. The Master Stone. This is the detail that gets lost in almost every discussion of the Palantíri, and it matters more than almost anything else in their history. Unfinished Tales essay is explicit. Among the seven stones, one held a unique function. The Osgiliath stone, kept in the great dome of the Tower of the Stone in Gondor's ancient capital, was the Master Stone, the one Palantir with the capacity to communicate freely with all the others, regardless of geographic alignment or pairing relationships. All the other stones had specific orientations, specific partner stones, with which communication was clearest and most natural. But Osgiliath could reach any of them. Osgiliath was the hub, the nerve center, the point through which the whole network could, in principle, remain coordinated and coherent. And in Third Age 1437, 5.5 centuries before Sauron even acquired the Ithil stone, Gondor tore itself apart in the civil war known as the Kin Strife. The Osgiliath stone was lost in the fires and the flooding of the Anduin, gone, unrecovered, destroyed as far as anyone could determine, in the violence of a fratricidal conflict that had nothing to do with Sauron, nothing to do with the enemy, nothing to do with anything but the internal political catastrophe of Gondor's ruling family. Here is why that matters, and pay attention to this next part, because it is where the whole architecture of the Third Age's tragedy begins to reveal itself. When the Osgiliath stone was lost, the seven Palantíri did not simply lose a communication channel. They lost coherence. They became isolated instruments, each capable of looking outward, each capable of forming contact with their paired stones, but no longer capable of being organized, coordinated, overseen in the way the network was designed to function. There was no longer any central point from which a master of all the stones could monitor their use, verify their communications, check what was being shown against what was being withheld. The network lost its immune system. Centuries before Sauron ever placed his hands on a stone, the Palantíri were already vulnerable in a structural, systemic way that no individual steward or king could fully compensate for. And when the Ithil stone fell to Sauron in 2002, he did not seize a weapon. He found a key that had been waiting, quietly, in a lock that history had already weakened. The question that emerges from this, and it is one Tolkien never directly answers, is whether the loss of the Osgiliath stone was a factor in the speed and completeness with which Sauron was able to corrupt subsequent users of the remaining stones. It seems impossible that it was not, because what the Master Stone would have provided, in addition to coordination, was a form of cross-verification. A sufficiently skilled user of the Master Stone could potentially have checked the visions being shown in one stone against the wider view available from the hub, could have identified when a particular stone was being selectively limited, could have at minimum provided a competing perspective against whatever Sauron chose to illuminate. Without it, each stone's user saw only what that stone, under Sauron's indirect influence, chose to reveal. Picture this. Gondor in the late Third Age. 2 Palantíri remain in its sphere of influence. The Orthanc stone, held by Saruman at Isengard. The Anor stone, kept in Minas Tirith. 2 great minds, each looking into their respective stones, each receiving a distinct and curated feed of true images. No Master Stone to provide a wider view. No way to cross-reference what one stone shows against what the other is showing. No way to know that the remarkable and overwhelming coherence of the picture Sauron is building, its relentless internal consistency, its devastating accuracy, is not a full portrait of reality, but a selected corridor through it. You cannot argue with what the stones show. That is the point. That is always the point. There is nothing to argue with, because nothing shown is false. Now let us talk about Saruman. Tolkien is careful, in Unfinished Tales and in the wider context of The Return of the King, to distinguish between the manner in which Saruman was corrupted and the manner in which Denethor was corrupted. The distinction is crucial, and the films collapse it entirely, because they present both men as essentially victims of a dark mirror, broken by what they saw. But that is not what the text describes at all. Saruman's use of the Orthanc stone almost certainly preceded his corruption. Tolkien suggests in Unfinished Tales that it was Saruman who discovered that the Orthanc stone was one of the 7, who retrieved it and began to use it in secret, and whose early communications through it, begun perhaps out of the purest possible motive of intelligence gathering, gradually shifted the structure of his ambitions. And here is what Tolkien describes as the mechanism of that shift, not in Unfinished Tales, but in the structure of Saruman's arc across the full text. Saruman saw power, not the threat of power, not the danger of power, power itself, actual and present and real, the genuine scope of what Sauron had rebuilt in Mordor, the true scale of the armies he was assembling, the real reach of his influence across Middle-earth. And what Saruman concluded from those true images was not that the West must resist at any cost, but that the West could not resist at all, and that the only rational position for a sufficiently intelligent being was to negotiate a position of usefulness within the inevitable new order. That is not a lie, Sauron told him. That is a conclusion Saruman drew from accurate information. But wait, because here is what nobody asks about Saruman's corruption. If the stones cannot lie, and if what Saruman saw was real, why are we certain his conclusion was wrong? Tolkien, in Letter 183, writes that Sauron in the Third Age was a dominator of minds whose control was expressed through fear and the despair of ever being able to resist. But despair is not necessarily irrational. A leader looking at overwhelming force and concluding that resistance is futile is not automatically wrong simply because we want the story to end differently. The answer Tolkien gives, the only answer that holds, is not that Sauron lied to Saruman about his strength. It is that Sauron showed Saruman his strength while concealing one specific truth, that his own power was not yet complete, that the ring was still lost, that there remained a genuine probability space in which the West could not only resist but prevail. Sauron showed the armies, he showed the fortresses, he showed the overwhelming weight of his accumulated dominion. What he did not show was the gap, the structural vulnerability, the one condition under which all of that power dissolved. He did not need to lie about his strength. He only needed to leave out the nature of his weakness. And because the Palantíri showed only what was real and present, and because the vulnerability of Sauron's dependence on the One Ring was not a scene that could be physically shown in a stone, the omission was technically compliant with the stone's own laws. That is curated truth. That is the mechanism at its most precise. Show everything real that confirms one conclusion. Leave dark everything real that complicates it. Now think about what that actually means for Denethor, because Denethor is a different and more devastating case entirely. Tolkien reveals something extraordinary in Unfinished Tales' Palantíri essay that most readers pass over too quickly. Denethor, steward of Gondor, was of sufficient mental power and will that when he used the Anor Stone, he was not dominated by Sauron the way Saruman was. His will was not broken. His mind was not entered. He remained, in the most technically precise sense, a free and autonomous user of the stone, receiving its visions but interpreting them through his own uncompromised intelligence. Read that again. Denethor was not corrupted in the crude sense. He was not deceived in any way that involved falsehood. He was not a puppet. He was, by Tolkien's own account, strong enough to look into the Palantir and maintain his own sovereignty of mind. And Sauron broke him anyway, because this is where the horror of the Palantíri reaches its full philosophical expression. And this is the part that changes everything. Picture this: a man of extraordinary intelligence, the sharpest political mind in Gondor, a leader who has spent decades administering a weakening kingdom against mounting pressure, sits alone in his tower with an instrument that shows him nothing but the truth. Night after night, year after year, he sees the armies gathering in Mordor. He sees the scale of Sauron's rebuilding, the fortresses, the Nazgûl, the strategic movements that prefigure the assault on Minas Tirith. He sees the corsairs of Umbar massing in the south. He sees the Haradrim moving from the east. He sees siege engines being constructed on a scale that dwarfs anything Gondor can field in response. He sees all of this, and he is intelligent enough to assess it accurately, rational enough to draw correct conclusions from correct data, strong enough of will that no foreign mind is doing his thinking for him. Every image he sees is real. Every assessment he makes is sound. Every conclusion he draws follows logically from the evidence presented. And the evidence, curated by the most psychologically sophisticated being in Middle-earth, points in one direction only: toward defeat. Always toward defeat. Not because defeat is inevitable, but because Sauron has arranged the corridor of illumination so precisely, has shown Denethor so many true images of true catastrophe, that the picture of hopelessness that accumulates in Denethor's mind is built entirely from real stones, assembled into a false wall. His intelligence is not a protection. His intelligence is the mechanism of his destruction. The sharper his perception, the more completely he processes what he sees. The stronger his will, the more firmly he believes that his uncoerced conclusions are trustworthy. The more clearly he understands strategic reality, the more devastatingly the curated selection of that reality works on him. Sauron could not have done this to a weak mind. A weak mind would have panicked, or prayed, or fled, or simply shut its eyes. It was precisely because Denethor was one of the greatest intellects of the Third Age that the strategy worked. His strength was the lever, his clarity was the blade. And this brings us back, heavier now, to the question at the center of all of this. If the Palantíri could never lie, if Sauron only ever showed what was real, was Denethor's despair a corruption? Or was it the most accurate strategic assessment made by any leader in the War of the Ring? We will return to that. But first, we need to understand what the Palantíri actually looked like from the inside, and why almost everyone who thinks about this question gets the mechanism wrong. One of the persistent misconceptions about how Sauron used the Ithil Stone is that he was actively broadcasting, that he sat in Mordor, looked into his stone, and deliberately projected specific images outward to whoever was on the other end, that he was, essentially, running a propaganda operation with a supernatural medium. This is not quite what Tolkien describes. And the difference between what Tolkien describes and the folk version of the story is where the real intellectual horror lives. What Unfinished Tales establishes is something more subtle. A weaker will looking into a stone did not see Sauron's chosen images superimposed over reality. They saw whatever the stone was aimed at, whatever the stone's natural range and orientation brought into view, under conditions shaped by the dominant will on the network. Sauron's influence over the Ithil Stone gave him something closer to editorial control than to authorial control. He could not write the content. He could only govern what the reader encountered on which page. The stone itself did the work of showing. Sauron's contribution was the shaping of context, the management of attention, the subtle pressure of a vast and ancient intelligence, directing where the user's gaze fell and where it slid away without quite registering. And here is what makes that distinction so important. Because it means that a user of sufficient will, someone like Denethor, was not experiencing Sauron's curated selection as external imposition. They were experiencing it as their own freely chosen line of sight. Denethor was not receiving a signal. He was looking, with his own eyes, through his own sovereign will, at a world that had been very quietly rearranged to present a specific face to whoever looked at it from the angle of the Anor Stone under Sauron's distant management of the network. He thought he was discovering the truth independently. He was, and he was not. Now pay attention to this next part, because the Fëanorian connection, the one established by letter 131, opens something here that has almost never been fully explored. Fëanor's defining tragedy was not his pride, exactly, though pride was certainly present. His tragedy was something more specific, the belief that total perception equals total understanding. He believed that if you could see something completely, hold it fully, examine it from every angle, you had therefore grasped its essential nature. The Silmarils were the expression of that belief, applied to light. But the philosophy itself was wrong, and Tolkien builds the entire catastrophe of the First Age partly around demonstrating its wrongness. Because you can hold the light of the two trees forever in 3 perfect jewels, and you cannot hold the grief of the Teleri, who died on the shores of Alqualonde. You can capture what a thing is. You cannot capture what a thing means to everyone it touches. Complete perception of the object does not confer understanding of the web of relationships and consequences that surround it. And the Palantíri, Fëanor's other great legacy, carry that same fundamental limitation encoded into their design. They show what is real and present. They show objects, scenes, armies, landscapes, physical facts. They cannot show interior states directly. They cannot show the private conviction of a hobbit in the Shire that the world is worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. They cannot show the specific quality of hope that motivates someone to walk into Mordor with a ring of power that is actively trying to enslave them. They cannot show Aragorn's certainty that the dead paths of the dead can be traveled by the heir of Isildur and that the Oathbreakers will follow. They show the measurable, the visible, the spatially present. They are blind to the unmeasurable. Which means that the portrait of the war that Sauron could construct from the Ithil Stone was genuinely incomplete, not because he withheld specific images, though he did that too, but because the stones themselves, by their nature, by the Fëanorian philosophy baked into their design, could not show the decisive factors. The factors that actually determined the outcome of the War of the Ring were interior. A choice made in a garden in Lothlorien, a refusal made on a mountain in Mordor. a moment of pity that happened in a cave decades before the war began. The Palantíri were ontologically incapable of registering any of them. Sauron was not just showing a selectively lit corridor of truth. He was showing a corridor of truth that, by the very nature of the instruments, could only ever contain certain kinds of facts. And the facts that mattered most existed entirely outside the stone's range of sight. Denethor was making a rational assessment from an inherently partial dataset. Not partial because Sauron was lying. Partial because the tools themselves could not see what ultimately decided everything. Picture this. Somewhere in Mordor, in the deep years of the Third Age, long after the network of Palantíri has been broken and scattered and its coherence lost, a vast and patient intelligence sits with a single stone and waits. He has waited for a very long time. He is not impatient. Impatience is a quality of beings who have finite time, and Sauron, whatever else he has become, does not think in finite terms. He watches. He watches the coasts of Gondor, the mountains of the White Range, the passages of the great rivers. He watches the politics of men playing out in miniature across the field of the stone. He notes who has the will to use which stone. He notes the character of each man who looks in, the specific shape of their intelligence, the particular structure of their fears. He is not yet ready to act. He is learning. He is building a psychological map of every potential user of every remaining stone, so that when the time comes, when the window opens and a mind connects to a stone under his influence, he will know exactly which true things to illuminate for exactly this mind in exactly this moment. He is not preparing deceptions. He is preparing revelations. Calibrated, timed, perfectly targeted truths, aimed with the precision of thousands of years of patient observation, at the specific vulnerabilities of specific great men. This is what it means to be a dominator of minds, not a liar, a selector of truths. Now we need to talk about Aragorn, because Aragorn's use of the Orthanc stone in the Return of the King is the moment when the entire logic of Sauron's strategy gets turned against him. And the way it gets turned is deeply revealing about what the stones actually were and what they could do. The Appendix A account and the main text of Return of the King are both clear about what happened. After Pippin's accidental look into the Orthanc stone following Saruman's defeat, Gandalf takes the stone, and eventually, in the encampment on the road south from Isengard, Aragorn reaches for it. Deliberately, with full knowledge of what he is doing. Tolkien writes that Aragorn had long debated whether to use the stone, and that he believed the time had come to reveal himself to Sauron, to present the image that Sauron least wanted to see, but could not dismiss as false, because the stone would verify it as real. Here is what Aragorn showed Sauron. Himself, the heir of Isildur, wielding Andúril, Narsil reforged, the blade that cut the ring from Sauron's hand, at the end of the Second Age. Alive, present, real, undeniably, verifiably, cosmologically bindingly real, because the stone would confirm it. And here is the thing that nobody fully unpacks about that moment. Aragorn did not win the contest of the Palantir because his will was stronger than Sauron's. Tolkien is careful not to claim that. What Aragorn did was weaponize a specific truth, one that Sauron had not anticipated and could not immediately process without strategic disruption. He played Sauron's own game back at him. He forced a revelation into the stone, the existence of the Dúnedain heir in full power and readiness, that destabilized Sauron's strategic picture precisely because it was real and could not be dismissed. And look at what Sauron did in response. Almost immediately afterward, he launched his assault on Minas Tirith. He moved before he was ready. He struck earlier than his strategic position fully justified, because the image in the stone had introduced an uncertainty he could not tolerate, a factor he needed to eliminate quickly before it could develop further. Aragorn did not beat Sauron at the Palantir. He panicked him. He introduced a true image into a curated system that had no place for it, and the system reacted exactly the way an intelligence operating on a carefully constructed picture of reality reacts when a true fact appears that does not fit the picture, with sudden destabilizing urgency. The master of curated truth was undone, briefly and decisively, by an uncurated truth he had not prepared for, which raises, quietly, a question about what else Sauron had not prepared for. What other true facts existed in the world that lay entirely outside the range of what any Palantir could show? We have already touched on this. But let us go further, because there is a specific truth that Sauron spent the entirety of the Third Age not seeing, could not see, and the fact that he could not see it has nothing to do with where he pointed the Ithil stone, or how carefully he managed the visions of the other stone's users. The Shire. Tolkien makes a remarkable observation in the context of Sauron's intelligence operations in the Third Age. Sauron knew about the One Ring. He knew Isildur had taken it. He knew it had been lost in the Anduin. He eventually, through the interrogation of Gollum in the late Third Age, learned that it had passed to a creature called Baggins, living somewhere called the Shire. But his understanding of the Shire, of hobbits in general, of the specific quality of life lived by small people in small places whose ambitions extend no further than their gardens, was essentially zero. Not because the Palantíri could not show the Shire geographically, they presumably could, but because what mattered about the Shire was not a scene that could be shown in any stone. What mattered was Bilbo Baggins' pity. What mattered was Frodo Baggins' willingness to carry something that was destroying him, not because he was strong enough to bear it, but because he was willing to be broken by it for a purpose larger than himself. What mattered was Sam Gamgee's specific and almost structural inability to give up on someone he cared about. These were not facts about positions or armies or physical objects. These were interior conditions of consciousness that no Palantir could resolve into a visible image. Sauron's intelligence apparatus, magnificent as it was constitutionally incapable of seeing the thing that defeated him. And this, perhaps, is the final and deepest expression of what Tolkien built into the Palantiri's Fëanorian design. Fëanor could capture the light of the trees, but not the love that lit them. His stones could capture the reality of Middle-earth, but not the values that ultimately determined what happened in it. And now we return, at last, to the question that this entire edifice has been building toward. And it lands differently now. It has more weight behind it. Let it settle. The same question, but you know more now than you did when we first asked it. Was Denethor's despair a corruption? Because here is what we can now say with precision. Denethor was shown, accurately, the real military situation. He was shown, without significant distortion of specific images, the genuine scale of Sauron's power. He was not lied to. He was not shown things that were not happening. His assessment of Gondor's strategic position, based on what the stone showed him, was in most respects sound. The armies he saw were real. The numbers he assessed were approximately accurate. The conclusion he drew, that Gondor could not withstand the assault alone, and that the West was unlikely to muster sufficient force in time, was a defensible conclusion from the available evidence. What Sauron took from him was not the capacity for rational thought. What Sauron took from him was access to the specific domain of truth that lay outside any Palantir's vision. The possibility space, the interior facts, the quality of determination in a hobbit walking across a landscape of ash, the probability, infinitesimally small by any rational strategic calculus, that the ring could be destroyed by the one creature in Middle-earth who had survived its long possession and who had been shaped by an act of pity into something that could, in one final moment of extremity, let it go. These were not things Denethor could see, and in the absence of any access to them, his rational mind, working on accurate but radically incomplete data, arrived at a rational but radically incomplete conclusion. That is the specific shape of his corruption, not deception, not domination, not the violation of his will, the narrowing of his epistemic field to everything Sauron could show and nothing that Sauron could not. His great intelligence, operating on a carefully bounded dataset, produced exactly the results Sauron needed it to produce. His brilliance was the mechanism. His sovereignty of mind was the guarantee that the conclusion would feel, to Denethor, entirely his own. Tolkien gives us one more detail about Denethor that almost nobody talks about. In The Return of the King, in the chapter titled The Pyre of Denethor, Gandalf tells Pippin something that sits quietly in the text and does not immediately announce its significance. He says that Denethor saw in the Palantír great forces arrayed against Gondor and concluded that resistance was vain. But Gandalf does not say Denethor was wrong about the forces. He says Denethor was wrong about what resistance means. What Gandalf is pointing at, though he does not quite say it this way, is the distinction between strategic despair and philosophical surrender. The forces were real, but the meaning of fighting against overwhelming force, the value of resistance, even in the face of defeat, the quality of defiance that insists on its own dignity regardless of its probability of success, this was outside any frame the stone could show. Denethor could see armies. He could not see why armies are sometimes worth fighting, even when you know you will lose. That was not a failure of his intelligence. It was a failure of his access to a dimension of truth that exists entirely beyond the reach of direct perception. And this, quietly, is perhaps the most Tolkienian idea in the entire edifice of the Palantíri's history. Because Tolkien, across every major work of the Legendarium, returns again and again to a specific conviction that the deepest truths are not the measurable ones. That the most significant facts about the world are not the facts that can be shown, pointed at, weighed, catalogued. That Eru's purposes move through history in a way that is invisible to any intelligence, however vast, that is oriented entirely toward the manipulation of visible, measurable, physical reality. Sauron, in Tolkien's moral universe, is the supreme embodiment of the belief that reality is exhausted by what can be perceived and measured and controlled. He is, in a very real sense, the ultimate empiricist. He can see everything that can be seen. He can calculate everything that can be calculated. He can shape every variable that can be shaped. And he loses, repeatedly and catastrophically, because the decisive variables in Tolkien's world are always the ones that cannot be measured. Pity, love, loyalty. The willingness of small things to carry large burdens. These are not spiritual abstractions in the Legendarium. They are causal forces that determine outcomes, and they are, every one of them, invisible to any Palantír. Picture this, the Pyre of Denethor. The steward of Gondor, one of the most formidable intellects of his age, lying down on the stone table he has prepared for himself and for his living son, holding a Palantír even as the flames are lit. Tolkien tells us this. He died with the stone in his hands. And what does that mean? What does it mean that even at the end, even as the fire takes him, he is holding the instrument of his destruction, his eyes closed against a world he has concluded is already lost? It means he still believed in what he had seen. He did not renounce it. He did not doubt it. The images were true. The conclusions were sound. Right up until the moment of his death, Denethor was a rational man, doing rational things in response to accurate information. And that, finally, is the specific quality of horror that makes his story unlike any other in the War of the Ring. He was not a villain. He was not a fool. He was not a weak man broken by a dark mirror. He was a man of extraordinary strength who was denied access to the only facts that would have changed his conclusion. And the instrument of that denial was not a lie. It was the truth. Precisely, surgically, cosmologically exactly the truth, in the specific quantity and selection that would lead a brilliant mind to its own annihilation. Now here is what we need to sit with, because this is where the lore argument stops being about Tolkien's world and starts being about something that reaches into ours. The Palantíri were not unique instruments in history because they could show the world. They were unique instruments because they could show the world accurately and incompletely simultaneously, because they could present a perfectly true picture of a partial reality and offer no way for the viewer to know that the frame was smaller than the world. Denethor had access to unprecedented volumes of accurate intelligence about the military situation of Middle-earth in the late Third Age. He had more accurate information than any other leader on the Western side, and he came to the most wrong possible conclusion about what to do with it. More information, more perfectly delivered, more completely true, and more catastrophically misleading. Tolkien built this into the design. The Palantíri were made by a mind that believed in total perception as the foundation of total understanding. And the story of the Third Age is partly the story of what happens when that belief meets reality. When the instrument designed to show everything real turns out to be capable of showing only the real things that fit within its frame, while the most real things of all, the things that actually determine the shape of history, remain permanently, constitutionally, cosmologically outside its sight. This is the hidden truth about what the Palantíri really were. Not surveillance technology, not communication tools, not dark mirrors. They were the grandest possible expression of the belief that seeing clearly is the same as understanding truly. And the War of the Ring is, among other things, the story of that belief's catastrophic failure, demonstrated simultaneously in the fall of Saruman, the fall of Denethor, and the survival of everything that Sauron could not see. Which brings us, for the last time, to the question we started with. But you are not the same person who heard it at the beginning of this video. You have walked through the history of the stones, from their Fëanorian origins, to the loss of the Master Stone, to the psychological architecture of Sauron's strategy, to the specific mechanism of Denethor's corruption. You have earned the right to hear this question in its full weight. Was Denethor's despair a corruption? And the answer that Tolkien's legendarium forces us to is not a clean one. Denethor's despair was both things simultaneously, and the simultaneity is the horror. It was corruption, because it was the product of a manipulated epistemic environment, a carefully bounded selection of truths, designed by an ancient and malevolent intelligence to produce exactly that outcome in exactly that mind. And it was also, within the bounds of what he could perceive, a rational and defensible response to accurate intelligence about a genuinely catastrophic strategic situation. The corruption did not require false data. It required denied access to the true facts that would have complicated the conclusion. And the denial was perfectly clean, because the stones themselves could not show what Sauron most needed hidden, the interior dimensions of truth that the Fëanorian design simply could not reach. Denethor was not broken. He was exhausted into a conclusion. By truth. By an instrument of perfect truth, applied with perfect selectivity to a mind too powerful to be broken any other way. And when we ask whether his despair was corruption or accurate assessment, Tolkien's answer seems to be yes, both, fully, at the same time. And there is no way to separate them, because the mechanism that made the assessment accurate is the same mechanism that made the corruption possible, and the intelligence that made Denethor worth corrupting is the intelligence that carried him all the way to the end without ever knowing that what he was seeing was not the whole truth. There is something in this that reaches past Middle-earth. Tolkien was not writing a simple fantasy adventure, and the longer you spend in the legendarium, the more clearly that becomes. He was writing about the nature of wisdom and its limits. He was writing about the terror of sophisticated intelligence deployed without access to the dimensions of truth that cannot be quantified. He was writing about the specific tragedy of great minds that can process everything they are shown and cannot see what is not shown to them. And the Palantíri, these ancient, Fëanorian, perfectly truthful instruments of perception, are the vehicle through which he stages the argument most precisely. The lesson is not that intelligence is dangerous, though it can be. The lesson is not that seeing clearly is harmful, though in a curated corridor it can lead you straight into a wall. The lesson is something more specific and more devastating. That the tools we trust most completely, the ones we trust because they have never shown us anything false, can be turned against us precisely by virtue of that trust. Because we stop asking what they cannot show. Because the consistent accuracy of what they have shown us before makes it almost impossible to conceive that there might be an entire category of truth entirely outside their range. Denethor trusted the stone. The stone earned that trust, because it never lied. And the trust that it earned was the mechanism through which a being of almost incomprehensible psychological sophistication walked him, step by accurate step, to a burning pyre in the highest tower of Minas Tirith, while the armies of the West were winning the war he had concluded was already lost. That is the hidden truth about what the Palantíri really were. Not mirrors of darkness, mirrors of truth. Partial, bounded, curated truth, shown by a perfect instrument to a perfect intelligence, in the service of a despair so complete that not even the sound of the horns of Rohan on the Pelennor could call Denethor back from the conclusion he had drawn from 1,000 true images that were never quite the whole picture. The most dangerous thing in Middle-earth was not the One Ring, if we measure danger by the specificity of the minds it destroyed. The One Ring was visible. Its corruption was legible. People warned each other about it. Gandalf refused to touch it. Galadriel refused it openly and understood exactly why she had to refuse. But the Palantíri, these ancient beautiful instruments of clear sight, these windows into the living present of the world, were trusted precisely because they had never shown anything false. And in that trust lived the most sophisticated trap ever devised by a being who understood that the greatest weapon is not a lie, but a truth, told with the lights arranged just so. If you have been thinking, somewhere in the back of your mind, that there is something uncomfortably familiar about this, that there is something recognizable about the experience of receiving accurate, verified, reliably true information from trusted sources and arriving at the wrong conclusion because the information was complete within its frame and the frame was smaller than the world, you are not wrong to feel that. Tolkien was writing mythology, but mythology that he believed expressed real and permanent truths about the way minds work and the way power operates, and the way the most sophisticated forms of domination have always looked less like overt control and more like the provision of a very good reason to give up. The Palantíri are not a fantasy artifact. They are a philosophical argument about seeing, about knowing, about the difference between the two, about what happens when a mind powerful enough to trust its own conclusions is provided with perfectly accurate data from which all the most important facts have been quietly, invisibly, cosmologically excluded. Denethor deserves more than he has received from this story. Not absolution, not heroism, but understanding. He was not weak. He was not credulous. He was not a lesser version of what a steward of Gondor should have been. He was the full expression of what that office could produce. A mind of extraordinary capability, deployed across a lifetime of genuine service. And he was destroyed by the one weapon that his strength could not defend against. Not darkness, not deception, truth. Selected with surgical care by an intelligence that had been studying him for centuries, that understood the specific architecture of his perception, and that knew exactly which true things to illuminate, to lead him, using nothing but his own uncompromised intelligence, all the way to despair. That is the legacy of the Palantíri. That is what Fëanor's philosophy of total perception produces when it meets a world whose most important truths are invisible to direct sight. That is what the loss of the Osgiliath stone, centuries before Sauron ever touched a Palantír, made structurally possible. And that is what Aragorn, in one desperate and brilliant act of counter-revelation, briefly interrupted, not by seeing more than Sauron, but by showing a truth Sauron had not prepared a corridor for. And the war was won, in the end, not by any act that any Palantír could have shown, not by armies or fortresses or the measured deployment of force, but by a hobbit standing on a mountain in Mordor, making a choice that no instrument, designed by the greatest craftsman of the First Age, could see, because the choice was interior, and small, and more real than anything the stones had ever shown. That is what the Palantíri could not capture, and that is, finally, what saved the world. If this question sits with you the way it sits with me, I would genuinely like to know how you read Denethor after this, not as a villain, not as a cautionary tale about pride, but as a man who was given 1,000 true images and denied the one true thing that would have changed the picture. Whether you think his despair was corruption or the most defensible conclusion anyone in his position could have drawn, whether you think wisdom requires access to facts that cannot be measured, or whether you think Tolkien is being unfair to the rational mind, that conversation matters, and I want to have it with you in the comments. This is the kind of question the Legendarium was built to ask. Keep looking. Keep following the text all the way down. There is always something else waiting underneath what you think you already know. And if you want to keep going deeper into the places where Tolkien's world reveals truths that reach past Middle-earth entirely, stay close. We are just getting started.